Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar on gender inclusion in hockey. Um, First off, I should introduce myself. My name is Zach Millington. I am the manager of risk registration and insurance at the Ontario Hockey Federation. Just some housekeeping notes to start off. Please keep your mics and your cameras off during the presentation, just to make it easier for everyone to be able to hear everything and focus on our presenter. Um, and there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So if you click on the Q&A tab at the top of the page or on the top of the webinar, you can put your questions in throughout, and then we'll answer your questions at the end of the session. If we don't have time for everyone, because we're expecting a lot of people on this call, if we don't have time for all the questions, then we'll make note of it and we'll get back to you um, and answer it as soon as we can. We'll also be joined later by our OHF Executive Director, Phil McKee. He'll be on later in the session and can also answer any questions that there are to answer as well. But before we start, I also first want to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on today. Our OHF office is in the Cambridge, Waterloo, and Kitchener area, so we would like to acknowledge the traditional territory of those many nations, including the Anawashabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the neutral Wanderon peoples. We acknowledge that it is important to remember that the Cambridge, Waterloo, and Kitchener area is within the Haldimand Tract. We acknowledge that the Haldimand Tract is its people to begin to reconcile the violation of the Treaty of 1784 and remember the significance of the land we are learning and working within. So with that said, it is also my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this session, Kai Scott. Kai comes from Trans Focus Consulting, and he is a social scientist who has spent his 15-year career researching and educating on complex social problems. He delivers engaging education sessions and compiles insightful data on gender diversity. That shifts perspectives and result in greater understanding, ease, and support. Specific to sport, Kai has also worked with Rugby Canada, Ringette Canada, Rowing Canada, Via Sport, and the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport to address the inclusion of trans and non-binary athletes. So once again, it's my pleasure to introduce Kai Scott, who will be leading the session tonight.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Zach, for that great introduction. It's fantastic to be with you all here today to talk about gender inclusion in hockey. By way of extending Zach's land acknowledgement, I want to say that I'm calling from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh, what is also known as Vancouver here. In particular, I'm calling in from a Squamish place name called Ealchin, which means on good footing. And I like to honor the original place names just as a way to show the connection, generations old connection that Indigenous people have had to the land, but also as a good frame for what we're trying to achieve here today on the topic of gender diversity, a better footing. By way of a little bit more of an introduction of myself, Zach let you know that I am a social scientist, and I've been so for about 15 years, and I've dealt with a lot of complex social issues, gender diversity being one of many. So I have a professional capacity, but I also have a personal touch point as it pertains to this topic. In particular, I am a transgender man, so that means I'm a man in terms of my gender identity, and I was female assigned at birth in terms of my sex. We'll go over some terms and concepts coming up pretty shortly here, but I just wanted to position myself within this much larger tapestry of gender diversity that exists. And of course, I can share a bit from my story, but of course there's so many more stories, and I'll try to draw from statistics to fill in those pieces so that you get a full, complete picture of the gender spectrum. What we're hoping to achieve here is a few things, really focusing in on trans and non-binary players within hockey and creating an environment of support and respect for them by better understanding the language, identifying some of the invisible challenges that exist, and also providing a bit more detail on the policy as well, or set of policies that have been introduced, as well as some supportive tools that you have access to better understand. Of course, Phil will fill in a little bit more detail at the end that is specific to OHF, but I'll be providing the broad overview. Then we'll go into how to prevent mistakes and how to recover from them if you make them. Just a little bit more on how to create that supportive culture beyond the supportive policies. And really, at the end of this session, hopefully have you understand the importance of this type of work and what you can specifically do on an individual level as well as a organization level. So here's the outline. We're starting with an introduction. We've got a bit of an icebreaker to get us started. Then we'll go into terms and concepts. We'll provide context, especially human rights legislation, and then some of the challenges that trans and non-binary folks face. There are many, but we'll give you a broad overview, and that'll tell us why there's a need for a supportive policy coupled with supportive cultural actions and steps that people take on the ground. And then we'll wrap up from there, have a bit of a Q&A, and then Phil will fill in a bit more detail on the dressing room policy specifically, and then we'll close out from there. Before we get started, it's important to understand that this is a two-part problem when it comes to trans and non-binary inclusion in hockey or sport more generally, hockey specifically. And there's a cultural aspect of how we interact with one another on a day-to-day basis. But there's also structural pieces that are at play as well in terms of barriers to accessing sport that also need to be addressed. And so, I mean, kind of need to look at both of those. They do fit together like a puzzle piece. And so really making sure that both are at play for this to be fully successful. Bit of housekeeping, Zach already mentioned, there's an opportunity to submit your questions. You can do so within MS Teams. There's also an opportunity to submit anonymous questions in case you're perhaps a little self-conscious about your question and wish to submit it without your name attached to it. And also we'll be doing a few different polls throughout the session to keep us engaged and interactive. So if you would wish to participate, it's menti.com. You just type that into any browser on your computer or your smartphone. And if you type in the code 7285780, you'll be sent directly to the page without any need to sign in or anything. And that will give you to the questions. And the page will refresh as I advance in the questions. So feel free to either submit questions that way, or MS Teams is another option. And within Menti, you can also upvote other people's questions in case you see a question that you also would like answered. I did want to set safety for learning as part of this session. I know sometimes people are pretty hesitant or even confused on the topic of gender diversity, and any one of these phrases are pretty common ones that we hear from people before they take a session like this. So if you are in that position, you're in the right place, and I'm here to support you in that learning journey. And so don't worry about getting things 100% correct. We'll work on them together to help you with what you need to set you up for success. So we have one question before we go to the icebreaker, and just checking in with folks where they're at with their knowledge of the policies that were introduced for trans and non-binary players within hockey. So it's okay if you don't know anything, but I just wanted to see where folks are at just to check in before we advance in the session. And I'll just flip over to the poll questions and their responses as they come in. So we've kind of got a good spread with majority, well, they're competing for one another right now, but kind of pretty evenly split between low and moderate level. So there are some folks who have heard about the policies and will continue to deepen that information. And then for those of you who have not heard of it yet, we'll give you the context that you need. So thank you for participating with that first one, just to check in where folks are at. Just give you a few more seconds to respond. And the next question is an icebreaker one. And this one, you don't need to have any prior knowledge on gender diversity, just knowledge of your own experience. And we're posing the question to kind of get us a sense of where gender is at play by thinking about our own past. So what is your earliest memory or recall of knowing your gender identity? And so we'll give you an opportunity to respond. There's many different places where people have that understanding of themselves, whether it's within a family context, within oneself, a self-understanding, related to school, whether it's teachers and how they interact, or washrooms that one uses. It could also be related to people's clothing or the clothing they wear, the toys that they play with. And finally, sport can play a role in people's understanding of their gender because of the teams that are sometimes set up and designated by gender. So I'll just give you a few more moments to check all that apply. It might not just be one of them, it might be a few of them. And to give you a sense already, we see a cross-section of different responses of people having that understanding, particularly within a family context. Those are coming through. And certainly there are folks just shy of half of you who have said that you can't recall a specific time where you had that understanding. Which is a very common response. So part of what's at play there could be that how people read you on the outside, family, friends, strangers may read you correctly as who you feel you are in the inside. And so there's not really anything to figure out, to declare, or to navigate. So there might be other things, but certainly not on this topic. So here we go. And really important just for us to know that we all have a gender, and we have various experiences around that, and many different touch points for that understanding. Of course, that is both how when we're our early years as children, but that also continues as we grow up into to being adults, whether it's within the sports that we play or the workplaces that we are at, and so forth. So this is very much at play and present in our society, and these are just a few examples of how that comes about. So thank you for participating in that, just to give us a kind of a lay of the land, so to speak, before we jump into the rest of the session. And a good place to start is terms and concepts, so that you have an understanding of what I mean by different terms that I'll be using throughout the rest of the presentation. So this will be rather brief. There is a longer version of what I'm presenting here if you wish to access that. It's available to associations, and it's about a half-hour long that goes into more terms, and well, not just more terms, but a deeper. So I'm kind of going to go through them rather quickly here. There's three concepts that are important to understand as part of this discussion. One of them is sex at birth. So that's things related to our bodies. It's typically something we're assigned at birth based on a variety of different factors, primarily sex characteristics. And it's done by a healthcare professional, and there's an assignment of either female or male based on an external scan of the body. And there's more than just female and male. There are folks who are intersex, so that does exist along a spectrum. Also, there is gender identity, and it is a separate concept, although for many related to their sex, of that internal sense of one, deep internal felt sense of one's gender. And there's also a spectrum there the most commonly known are girls and women, boys and men, different ages, but so there's two of each there. But there's also beyond just the two. There are folks that we're going to talk about in the next slide that are, there's the term non-binary. So gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and then the last one is gender expression. So if you think about the first two bullets, they're more internal matters. When we're talking about gender expression, it's all the external aspects, whether it's how we dress or how we are the pitch of our voice. It could be related to mannerisms and accessories and so forth, and even hair levels, short or long. And this also exists along a spectrum, whether it's feminine or masculine or androgynous. And so these help us understand the diversity that exists in a little bit better way when we differentiate these as separate concepts. In the next slide, we'll talk about some terms where we differentiate between them a bit further. And then we have a visual that brings this all together in just a few seconds. So we have a few key terms, in particular cisgender, or cis for short. It comes from the Latin, which means on the same side of, and essentially it's anyone whose sex assigned at birth is aligned to their gender identity. So most people are cisgender. So for example, somebody female assigned at birth in terms of their sex, who is a woman in terms of their gender identity, is a cisgender woman or a cis woman. Similarly, for somebody male assigned at birth that identifies as a man is a cisgender man. Now, sometimes people get a little nervous at this point. They feel like, wow, this is a lot of extra terminology. Is it really necessary to have this? And do I have to use it for myself? So number one, you don't have to use it for yourself if you don't want to. But I would say that cisgender is really handy in certain settings. In particular, when we're trying to compare people who are trans and those who aren't, because there are differences and it's okay to talk about those differences, but it's just how you do that that is really important. So an example from my own story or history, when people without intention to harm me said things to me that said, there are trans men and then there's real men. And you can see that by using the word real, there's a judgment that's passed on trans men in this particular example. And that's where cisgender is a much better way to describe. So trans men, cis men, and then talking about the differences. As I mentioned, there are folks who are non-binary. So those are folks who don't identify as either men nor women. So somewhere between or completely outside of those two concepts. There's many different terms to describe that, which we won't go into detail here, but we have in a recording if you wish to learn more. There's also two-spirit folks, and that's an Indigenous specific term that it spans or speaks to spiritual and cultural roles and responsibilities based on gender diversity and or sexual diversity. It depends on the individual what's at play for them. It was coined in the 1990s as a way to reclaim old roles and responsibilities that were lost or damaged through colonial injustices. So there were laws that were put in place that drove two-spirit people underground in their nations. So it's a reclaiming process for them. Just a grammar note, all of these terms listed here are adjectives, so they describe something. And so you always want to combine them with a noun. So it's not just two cisgenders walk down the street, it's two cisgender people or two cisgender men, etc. So you always want to have that person, issue, some other thing that you're combining it with. Many people are curious how many trans people there are. And before I used to just say, we have a guess, but we don't really know. And now, because of the census that was collected in 2021, and they asked about trans and non-binary folks, we now have a really good idea. And basically, we find nationally, there's 1 in 300 people that are trans. That varies a bit province to province and even city to city, but that's the average there. And that really gives us important insight. If you think about the numbers of people on your teams or in your associations, you can have a pretty good sense of how many people you have that are trans by this estimate. So let's bring all of those different concepts together in this visual that both shows everything is along a spectrum. So it's not just two of each of the concepts. They're also distinct from one another as different dimensions, even though for most there is alignment on one side or the other of this visual. As you can see, anyone can plot themselves. I've done so for my own experience. And as I mentioned, I am a man in terms of my gender identity, and I was female assigned at birth in terms of my sex. And the combination of those, because they're different, is the definition for transgender. So that's why I'm trans. A little bit surprising for some is that my gender expression is a bit more on the feminine side of things. That shows up in floral prints that I wear, or I'm more expressive with my hand gesturing, or I'm more nurturing in terms of my personality. Why we've labeled those things feminine, we can have a really long discussion about, but I will say that people make assumptions about who I am based on knowing that I'm a man and I'm a bit more feminine in terms of my gender expression. In particular, people assume that I'm a gay man, which I'm always honored to be assumed as such, but is not actually my sexual orientation. So you can start to see how we might select one or two pieces of information and then draw conclusions about the rest of the dimensions here, which may be correct sometimes, but actually for many are incorrect. And we'll talk about assumptions in the inclusive culture section, but it does present quite a few challenges for folks. Also, I would want to just explain a little bit that in our society, we have very strong expectations that people line up on one side or the other of this visual. It's not just that the most people do have alignment, it's that we expect that that's the only way that people are. So that doesn't give a lot of space for people in between or crisscrossing in this visual. Also just mention that for gender expression, and this is not just trans people, that there's a bit more movement in this on this dimension. So people may shift to one side or the other of this trajectory or spectrum based on different needs that they might have. I'll give you an example. I used to work in the mining industry, and as you know, as a man with more feminine gender expression, when I went onto mine sites, I would very intentionally shift my gender expression to be more masculine. I did that for my own safety because it was very clear that feminine expressing men were not welcome or accepted. And I did it for the safety of others. So I was able to lead a team through the mine site. So this gives you some insight into the different dimensions, that they're separate from one another, there's more than two, and that there's dynamics between them, and a bit of how we can sometimes jump to conclusions, which will share alternatives to that rather than making assumptions. Okay, I'll just pause here just to see if there are any questions specific to terms and concepts before rushing on. If I don't hear any, I will continue on. And if you need any clarification at the end, feel free to ask. So there have been some legal changes in the past 5 to 10 years, both on a provincial as well as a federal level. Basically, gender identity and expression, those two concepts have been added to protected grounds for human rights legislation. It started as early as 2012 in Ontario and then ended with the Canadian Human Rights Act in 2017. This is added to the existing category of sex or sex at birth, and all three of those provide those wraparound protections for transgender people. The law tends to be pretty broad, and details are clarified in court cases, and there's two specific topics that have been clarified in courts over the course, especially for washrooms, almost 3 decades now of clarity around that. And also pronouns more recently. And we just have a few slides to break those down a little bit further. And feel free to click on the link and you'll get a copy of the slide deck, and you can click on the link and learn more about at least this one specific case. There's others as well. But basically, people can use the washrooms or the dressing rooms that align with their gender identity. This is really important because it's different from, or it's not based on sex. So this is an important clarification for trans people for whom there's a difference between their gender and their sex. This is done without the need for surgeries or documents, or there's time for a trans person to figure that out for themselves, which washroom they go to and when. And so there's that space provided for them to figure it out. But a very key thing is that there's no kind of prerequisites, if you will. It's based on self-determination. There's also case law more recently in 2021 that has clarified the importance of pronouns, and in particular defining intentional misgendering. So that's if somebody knows a pronoun and refuses to use it, that is considered discriminatory in nature. And this helps us understand the importance. In particular, it's really important for leaders to intervene in a timely way if there is this type of action happening. So to address the matter, it's not kind of letting it go without addressing it head on. This is very different from accidental misgendering, which if part of a learning process, if a pronoun is new to somebody or somebody has recently shared a new pronoun, that there's time for learning that. So that's not, accidental is different from intentional in that way. Most people will likely be doing accidental misgendering, which is not considered discriminatory. It's part of a learning process. There's also been, besides the legal changes, also some administrative changes. In particular, the provinces and territories in turquoise on this map have now added gender X to as a gender marker to the existing categories of M and F. This is important recognition of folks who are non-binary, and trans men and women would still be accessing M and F for themselves. So for myself, I have M on my driver's licenses and other documents, but for non-binary folks, X is very key part of recognition. It's also possible on passports, but people are less, not really keen on putting that and not knowing how that'll be received in other countries. So that now we have a bit more context, I'm going to shift into some of the common challenges that trans and non-binary folks face more generally, but also more specifically within sport. We've got a little video here that just shares some of the challenges that folks face. This is not just for trans people, it's it's also including lesbian, gay, bisexual folks, but there's a few trans people in here that just shed light on that challenge for themselves. So we'll watch that and then carry on.
I had a guy call me a faggot in the middle of the game.
There's so many trans guys that want to play sport, but they can't or they won't because they're too afraid to.
You don't want girls to feel uncomfortable because you're touching them and they think that it's because you're gay, when it's actually just because you're playing the sport.
It's scary to be different.
I was a bit nervous about joining the club because I was worried about people's discrimination and stuff like that.
I think there's this perception that being gay is less than.
People often assume that lesbians playing sport are going to be really dykey and really tough and aggressive.
It was a common thing, don't be gay, or don't be soft, or don't be a girl.
I came out as bi and I had a male partner. People were like, but what does that really mean?
I was called a faggot and physically attacked during a game.
In high school, I remember specifically never wanting anyone to know that I was gay, because when it did come to PE and we were in the change rooms or getting ready, I didn't want girls to feel uncomfortable because they thought that I was creeping on them.
Like, I'm in a Facebook group, I think there's 800 members. Not all of them are trans men, but predominantly in Victoria. And consistently threads come up. Does anyone know like what this team would be like if I went to play with them, or like it's a theme that a lot of young trans guys are too scared to join a cis men or a proper men's team, because they're afraid of how everyone's going to treat them.
I did not feel comfortable.
In the interest of time, I'll cut it here, but I invite you to watch the rest of the video. It's another minute or so past this, but this just gives you some sense of the challenges that trans and non-binary folks face, and also lesbian, gay, bisexual folks as well. So this visual is a really good one to describe the kind of cyclical nature of the challenges and how they continue to exist, particularly if there's no intervention. It starts from fairly early age in sport, and whether people hear transphobic or homophobic comments on the ice or anywhere else, and observing that there's a positive response to those in laughter or agreement of any sort. And then from there, that just reinforces that people are not accepted within that sport. And that can typically be reinforced, especially among boys, and the desire to conform and to be a part of can unfortunately, increase that likelihood of happening. And if there's no adult or any other type of intervention to push back on those, then they're accepted as kind of a normal part of the sport. And so in so doing, it creates then the next generation of folks who think this is okay, and also for those who are LGBT or lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, they then that often creates a hesitation for them to come forward and share more about who they are within the context of sport. So unfortunately, this is something that has a feedback loop and creates more challenge for folks on teams. Just a bit more in terms of the different trade-offs that exist for folks, in particular around sharing more about themselves or wondering whether or not it's safe for them to be a part of the sport. They're often having to assess whether I share something and I'm seen for the person that I am, or part of my identity, or do I remain silent and I'm safe? And there's a tension between being seen and safe for a lot of trans and non-binary folks. Hopefully, because of sessions like today, we can have it be so people can be seen and safe at the same time. And that's an important part of the creating policy and a more supportive culture. There are a range of different challenges that folks face, from the more subtle to the overt. Overt ones, I think, are easier for folks to identify if they don't share that experience. But assumptions and jokes and the kind of more subtle side tend to be more difficult for folks to know about and to know when to intervene and how. So I won't go too much into the overt discrimination. Some of these are pretty obvious, or you're aware of them from other equity-seeking groups, but not playing, working with somebody who's trans, leaving people out, refusing to provide accommodation, intentional misgendering, like I noted, and intentional outing. So sharing with others that this person is trans with the intention to hurt that person, because it's still quite stigmatized to be transgender in this day and age. Here are some statistics that just give us the gravity of the situation on the playing field or on the ice, and in terms of hearing homophobic or transphobic language, facing discrimination, especially for trans women, and whether or not people feel safe to come out, which a majority of folks don't. And this is from surveys done of 5,400 as well as 7,000 participants. So quite a large sample size that tell us an overwhelming story of exclusion. The subtle challenges are varied. There can be jokes, there can be invasive questions, there can be accidental outing. So maybe somebody didn't intend to hurt somebody, but they did do so in the process of sharing that somebody is transgender. Sometimes people share with the intention to be helpful, think that saying somebody is trans will help explain something, but actually makes things worse. There's also accidental misgendering, so either not knowing somebody's pronoun and using an incorrect one, or forgetting somebody's proper pronoun. These are, just because they're subtle doesn't mean that it necessarily means it has a low impact on folks. If something is happens quite frequently, it can have quite a severe mental health impact on folks, to the point where some people socially isolate because it's just too much to handle and move forward on. And these are some of the examples of folks that either ask invasive questions or push back on people's pronouns or make fun of something that's really important to trans people. And in particular, misgendering does happen quite frequently. So people making assumptions about what somebody's pronouns are based on how they look. And we know from a study of 3,000 trans people across Canada that a majority of non-binary folks face this, as well as a quarter of trans men and women, and on a daily basis. And I just pause here because that's very, very frequent and very difficult to navigate. People don't necessarily feel safe or confident to correct people. So unfortunately, the error persists and makes it difficult for folks. And they're very upset by that, or very upset by that experience. And so there's more that could be done to help them out. And we'll share about that in the inclusive supportive culture section. Besides the more general challenges, whether they be subtle or overt, there's also access issues to sport. And there's many reasons why trans and non-binary folks lack that access. Some of it is related to how teams are set up based on gender designation. So a women's and men's team, particularly for non-binary folks, it's, where do you go? Because neither one aligns with one's gender identity. Change rooms or dressing rooms are also another key touch point of difficulty for non-binary folks specifically, but also for trans men and women, where we have very specific narrow notions of who is a man and a woman that can present challenges and pushback. There's also some misunderstanding around trans athletes, specifically trans women, in terms of their physicality and their, competitive fairness. We'll address that in some slides to come, but that can also present challenges for access because of a lot of pushback for their participation. And hence why we need policies and procedures to specifically address those challenges and clarify things so that there's more confidence, more ability to show up, knowing that there's the support from the organization. Just a few more comments on washing rooms and dressing rooms. In particular, there is quite a bit of challenge in trying to get a washroom or change rooms that are appropriate for folks. So especially if there's only men's and women's facilities, that can often present challenges for non-binary folks, where if they don't find the desired facility, they are faced with some tough decisions. In particular, they either go to something that doesn't meet their needs. They access a men's and a women's or a men's or women's facilities, but in doing so, they are likely to face harassment from other facility users, or they go to another floor looking for an option, or they go to another building, but in doing so, they expend more energy, which can make them late for practice or, challenged in some other way. And then there are some who avoid washrooms or change rooms altogether because it's just too much of a hassle one way or the other. And so with that strategy, unfortunately, it's not cost-free. People who hold until they get home, unfortunately, face health consequences, particularly urinary tract infections, which are disproportionately higher among trans and non-binary folks. So as a result, we've got some data from the United States of 27,000 trans people, which was done in 2015, and majority of folks avoid washrooms altogether because of that fear of harassment. And in doing so, to be able to make it home, they have to adopt a strategy. About a third of them adopt a strategy of not drinking and not eating to be able to go at home. And this, within the context of sport, as many of you can appreciate, that puts them in a very precarious position because, of course, you really need food and drink as part of a rigorous exercise. And so this is a very dangerous thing that happens to them. So as part of that, really important to shift some of the culture around washrooms and change rooms. So next, we want to talk a little bit more about supportive policy. So now that we understand the challenges, hopefully it's a little bit clearer why there is need for policy change or introduction of policy. And specifically, there's two different policies that are being introduced. One is a gender identity and expression policy, and the other is a dressing room policy. And each one of them comes with supporting materials, whether they be a frequently asked question document that goes through very common questions and answers them, as well as an implementation guide for the dressing room policy. Now, Phil will provide some additional context that will give you more details, especially within OHF, but this is just a broad picture for now. And all of these materials were developed by Hockey Canada and really helps us understand how trans and non-binary folks can participate in the sport and access dressing rooms in ways that address some of the challenges that I just spoke to. So what does the gender identity and expression policy say? They're in the key points. There's a lot of content in it, but the key pieces are that people can, trans and non-binary folks can participate in the team that aligns with their gender identity. And they can do so without any surgery, hormones, or having to share that they are trans. So this is really important clarification because oftentimes people wonder if it's based on their sex or their gender. And so this clarifies it based on gender. For non-binary folks, they can choose the team. They can go into the team of their choice. Of course, there are exceptions to this key piece in that that's covers competition within Canada. Once you go to any other international competition, there are other bodies that govern and may have different types of regulation around trans and non-binary athletes. So it's referring to those before competing at an international level. There's also clarification around registration systems, particularly expanding the number of options that people can respond to, as well when we're collecting gender, and clarifying that it's gender, we're collecting gender, not sex. So that's an important clarification and provides those categories for responses. Finally, it's also underscoring the importance of respecting somebody's chosen first name and pronouns. Chosen because for some trans people, there's a difference between what's on their legal documents versus what they go by day to day. And so it's always respecting the name that they have given, irrespective of what is on their legal documents. This also applies to pronouns. So if somebody has provided a pronoun, it's important to respect it and to use it. Of course, understanding that there may be a bit of practice to make that possible. Dressing room policy. Again, Phil will provide more detail on this, but at a very broad level, there's a few different things that have been introduced. And this is coming from the other organizations that have already applied this. So this is not coming from nowhere. This is also something that's happening in other places. In particular, dressing rooms are defined as team spaces. And this is a really important concept because for some teams, there might be multiple genders on that team, even if it's designated for a particular gender. There are many different scenarios that make that happen. And so it's important to, rather than having a dressing room designated by gender, it's actually a space for that team to be together, as many as are comfortable to do so. And in doing that, it's really important to introduce a level of privacy to make that possible. And a way to achieve that is to have what's called minimum attire, so a top and a bottom, in dressing room in the common spaces of those dressing rooms. And of course, when people go into a change booth or into a private stall, that's where undress can happen. And for showering, there's a slight it's only recommended, not required. Again, Phil will speak to requirements for OHF a little bit later on. It's really important that all players be present in the dressing room for team discussions so that people aren't left out. Some people might need accommodation and may not dress in the dressing room with the team, but making sure that if you have discussions that everybody's present again. So even though privacy has been introduced, that may not be enough for some people, and in which case they may be asking for additional accommodation beyond what has been set up. There could be many different reasons for that. Gender is only one of those, but certainly an important one. There could be religious factors or medical considerations. And so all of these are important to accommodate, to find other places within the building for somebody to change if they request it. Again, Phil will provide more detail on that, but there is an implementation guide that shows you how step by step to do that, so that you can explore the options, report back what the options are, and so forth. So that is an important task to complete. Again, if requested. And the reason for this dressing room policy is to provide that equitable, safe access for folks. This is not just for trans people. This is more general that there, and we've seen this in the research that TransFocus has done, there's an increasing desire and need for privacy within change spaces. So even if one or more people are comfortable with nudity, it is not everybody who will be that comfortable. And so it's trying to make things to the sport more accessible by helping with those various needs. So now that we've described both the gender identity and expression policy, as well as the dressing room policy, next I have a few frequently asked questions that I wanted just to kind of unpack with you here to address some of the either concerns you have specifically, or perhaps you might be talking to people who have those concerns, and you can provide some of these points to them. So people wonder how to address parents that are upset by this policy or these policies. And really, it's important to express the core intent of the policies in that they're about inclusion and participation. So just explaining that there are unique challenges that trans and non-binary folks face as a smaller population. They often, there's just that much more that they face. And so this policy is a way to explain how and where they can access the sport to ensure that they more fully can participate. What if a participant on another team asks about a trans or non-binary employee? And this is really a good question because it helps us to talk about privacy. In particular, some people think that they may want to share somebody is trans or non-binary as almost a way to explain why somebody is on a team, but it's really important not to share that information with others unless you've got express consent from the person. But I would err on the side of not sharing. Instead, you can have a very simple response that says this person's on the right team, and then it's done. It's not for them to determine that for somebody. If you wanted to get into a larger conversation separate from the individual trans player, you could go into a bit about, how somebody looks or the shape of their body doesn't necessarily determine their identity one way or another. So hopefully that helps people to not jump to conclusions in ways that I previously described. Another question that comes up, especially around the gender identity and expression policy, is what if participants say it's unfair? This comes up a lot for trans women participating in women's hockey. And in doing so, if you wish, you can explain that this is very much about equitable access to sport. And this is a way to address those unique challenges that I shared earlier. And also, there is an opportunity to share literature with them that shows that trans women don't have an unfair advantage, that there's many different complex factors at play. Certainly, physicality is an important variable in sport, but that it's unfairly or only focused on trans people when actually there's such a variety even among cis people. And so this is very effectively put together by a literature review that this Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport did. And we've got a link down below in case you want to share that with anyone who is interested in the topic and learning more. There is also a concern that cis men will misuse the policy as a way to cheat essentially access to women's sport in order to compete and win. First of all, there's no instance of that happening, no recorded instance of that happening. And the kind of underlying misunderstanding there is often that it's easy to transition or to be trans, when in fact, actually it's quite a lengthy process as well as a difficult one that essentially disrupts a lot of people's lives. That doesn't seem like a really good easy thing to get to cheat. In fact, there's many other ways of cheating, not that we're condoning it or saying that they should, but this one would not be that. And so there's not, that's not a method of cheating that is known and is likely more difficult than people know or imagine. Others are curious as to who else has adopted these types of policies. Certainly many examples, even here within your own organization with the OHF, but also hockey. Newfoundland and Labrador have adopted these policies for many years now, and other sports as well. So the majority of national sports organizations have adopted some version or the exact version for almost 6 years now. So there's quite a bit of experience also in the United States as well as Europe. So there's plenty of experiences around this and it working well and being an important part of having greater inclusion for trans or greater participation among trans and non-binary folks. So that's everything about the policies. And now I just have a few more slides to share a little bit more on supportive culture before we go to a general Q&A, and then after that we'll hear more from Phil. So with all of what I'm going to share next, the overarching framework is one of allyship. So essentially being there for trans and non-binary folks to understand the issues, to be looking out for them, to be able to respond and ready to respond to them, especially if you think about harmful things like jokes or disparaging comments. It's about listening to the needs or the concerns of any trans people that come forward. A lot of trans people don't feel safe to come forward and share their needs, but if they do, it's a big deal, and to do so with humility. And if you make mistakes, it's not the end of the world. It's okay to make mistakes. The important part is how you recover from those mistakes. And we'll share a few tips on how to do that. And of course, if you can, and if you have folks there, it's really important to make that extra effort to show that support. and you're not expected to know all the answers. This is likely a new topic for many. So if you need to, absolutely ask for help or for clarification. People are here to support. And everyone plays a part in creating that safety and that inclusive culture. I already spoke briefly on privacy, but just wanted to make a few more points on that. Generally, in our society, we do want to know people's gender. We think that by knowing that, we can fill in a bunch of other things about that person, or we want to know their past and so forth. There's certainly curiosity about especially trans and non-binary folks, and it's not a bad thing to be curious. I think that's a good thing, but it's just where you place that curiosity. Sometimes people can, by how they're asking questions or what they're kind of trying to get from somebody, they can almost be insistent on that information, and that can put a lot of pressure on somebody. But really, you don't need to know somebody's gender. You just actually need to know their first name and or their pronouns. So those are the two most important pieces of information. Everything else, perhaps somebody will share, perhaps they won't, but it's not critical to respectful interactions. It can come later on or not at all. Another really important thing around privacy is to avoid gossiping about somebody or to intervene if you witness gossiping. So being trans is still very much kind of the salacious detail that sometimes gets passed along in whisper campaigns. And this can be very harmful to trans and non-binary folks. It puts them in a precarious position because there's still stigma attached to being trans. So what are some of the responsibilities of associations? It's about that inclusive environment, that safe environment, obviously not just for trans people, but including trans folks in that. It's important to do that with or without knowing that somebody trans is on your team. So that is key, and you can set the tone by making sure people understand that there's respect for trans and non-binary folks. Perhaps you may be fielding questions that people have on your teams or within your organization. And responding to those jokes when they come up, not just letting them slide by, is really key, because somebody might not be out, and if those comments get unaddressed, then that puts a chilling impact on somebody trans, so they're less likely to come out. Some specific actions you can take is if you see a structural issue, is working, like identifying it and raising it with others and working on it. You can share articles about trans and non-binary issues. There are specific days each year that commemorate different things within the trans community. Particularly coming up the end of November is the Trans Day of Remembrance, where we tragically lose a lot of people to transphobic murder or homicide, and especially among Black trans women. And so on that day, we commemorate who we've lost, and as a way to motivate us to keep going to what changes need to be made. Trans Day Visibility is about people sharing their stories and what makes them proud to be trans, and that happens in March. Another key thing that you can do to create space for people to share their own stories in their own time is not to make assumptions about people's past. So an example from my own story is that if people don't know that I'm trans, they make assumptions that I was raised and socialized as a boy. And so they make all kinds of assumptions. So they'll think I've gone to Boy Scouts or, played on a boys' team in sports and so forth. And that's not the case for me. And so that puts me in a position of having to figure out, do I correct them and say I didn't do that? Or do I just let it slide? And, there's that safety piece there. So it puts that person in a difficult spot. So it's best to avoid those assumptions and just be open and say, tell me more about yourself, or, this was my experience. What was your experience? So things like that can make a big difference for folks. There's so much interconnection, especially on social media. So you may be connected to somebody, a trans player on social media, where they may share more about themselves than they do on Teams. And it's really important not to share that with others. Allowing that person their own time. If they choose to, they can share, but not to bring that. Even though it's publicly available, it's important for that person to do it on their own time. You may have a quick conversation to say, hey, I noticed you changed your pronouns on Facebook. Is there anything I can do to support you? That might be a good question if you're very close to that person, but otherwise it's best just to leave it. So I have another question here, poll question on just before we shift into some changes that can be made about assumptions. I'm curious to hear of your own experiences. Doesn't have to be on gender, how you respond to somebody making repeated incorrect assumptions about you. So there's a few different options here, whether it's angry, anxious, frustrated, neutral, confused, or perhaps this doesn't happen to you. Some people have mentioned they have an accent and people assume that they don't know English, or they're tall and everybody assumes they play basketball. There's also another one where people are tattooed and people think that they're rough or mean in nature. So there's just a few examples. There's others. And so we have a few people providing their responses here. And we can see that, a lot of folks are saying frustrated, which is a very common response. Some people can be neutral about it. So they just like, well, that's on that person. If they make the assumption, no big deal for me. Others are anxious or sad as well. So and then a few of you, about 1/5, don't have this particular experience. But you can already see that, across a few of you, or a good number of you, there's quite a range of different responses. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as we think about the assumptions that trans and non-binary folks face, and how they may similarly have a range of different responses to those. Okay, so a few things to note when, especially if we're meeting somebody for the first time, there's a few things you can do instead of what we typically do, which is jump to conclusions about someone, typically based on how they look or their first name or some other thing, the pitch of their voice. But really, it's best to pause when you're learning, getting to know somebody, and just remind yourself that you don't know this person's gender or their pronouns, and best to get that information directly from them rather than assuming, essentially. And you can ask a few questions just to make sure you check in with yourself about whether you heard directly from them or you're doing that assuming. And instead of assuming, there's a few other things you can do. You can obtain pronouns directly from somebody. There's a few different ways of doing that. There's no kind of right or wrong way. There's just different situations. So if you're just going to interact with someone briefly and then never talk to them again, you may choose one or two of these options. So just use gender neutral pronouns for that person. So this athlete wants to play. They are really good. Or you just use their first name instead of any pronoun. Or you can ask, it's also perfectly fine to ask somebody and say, what are your pronouns? I would drop preferred, just no preferred, just what are your pronouns? I usually like to explain a little bit by saying, I don't want to assume. And if you adopt this strategy of ask directly, it's good to ask everybody. So not just the people you're unsure of, but the people that everyone, because there are some people who are feminine or masculine looking that are non-binary and use they, them pronouns or some other pronoun. If you have a little bit more time to get to know somebody, you can check around to see if they've provided their pronouns in a system or on LinkedIn or signature, email signature, or you can model it as part of your introduction. So if you're first meeting someone, you can say, or I would say, or I do say, my name is Kai. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a gender strategist at TransFocus Consulting. And then people will respond in kind. But if they don't provide a pronoun, that's okay too, because of course it's voluntary. We never force anybody to provide their pronoun. I would say too, as part of a preseason chat or check-in, I think it's really important just to describe what pronouns are, how to navigate them, and rather than kind of forcing everybody to do an introduction. So there's a few things that you can do there as well, just to set the stage so people feel comfortable to share if they want to. Why is this important to ask for or find some way of obtaining a pronoun? Is just to foster that inclusive culture where it's not this big deal if people exchange pronouns. And it doesn't have to be everybody, but some number of people are doing that. It avoids that spotlighting when it's just one or two people providing their pronouns, particularly trans and non-binary folks. And it reduces that or eliminates that anxiety that people feel when they have to figure out when to do it, when it's just a normal part of the culture. And it does reduce the amount of error that occurs because that information has been provided. So what if you make mistakes? If this is a new topic for you, chances are that it could happen. And again, like I said at the top of the session, it's not so much that if like that you made a mistake, it's how you recover from that mistake. That is the most important thing. Of course, you know, it might feel bad that you did that, but really it's just focused on apologizing and correcting yourself. It's not about being perfect. That you will kind of learn new habits over time as you practice them. And it's if you do take it seriously, people know that you care. And that's a really key thing, is that you're not dismissing them or you know, thinking that this is not a big deal. It's really important for you to make that correction. And of course, practice makes things easier, and so that's recommended as well. So if you're making the mistake, it's just a quick apology and a correction. You're not going on and on with that apology. It's very matter of fact and quick. You know, of course, if you keep making the mistake, it's important to practice. You can do that one-on-one with or without the person. And in a group, it's really important to make that correction. If you're talking to a team and you misgender somebody, that person, those team members could think that's the correct way of you know, using somebody's pronoun when it isn't. So that correction is really key. If you witness other people making mistakes, you can be supportive towards them. If it's one-on-one, you could just say, I think you meant they, them, as an example. It could be very gentle. We don't need to, you know, shame or blame anybody. It's more just coming alongside them. Perhaps you can offer to practice with them. Recently, I had somebody who came out to me using ze/zer as a neo pronoun, and I had to practice that. It was, even though I've been talking about it, I hadn't actually practiced it. So it was a good opportunity for me to learn that and to make it flow off the tongue. If, as you hear somebody about group misgendering in group context, it's really important to check in with a trans person to come up with a plan. Sometimes they like to handle it on their own. Other times they want help from other folks. So you'll just talk with them to see where they're at with that. So we're about to wrap up here and have a few more minutes for questions for what I presented, and then I'll pass things off to Phil for the last 10 or so minutes to talk specifically about the dressing room policy in further depth. But key takeaways is really about bringing the policy to life. So using the guidance provided as well as the communications. We're really following the lead of trans people in terms of what they need, if they've come forward and shared what they need, and if they've provided pronouns and name, first name, it's really important to use them. And also, if it's new to you, you might have to practice as part of making it easier for you. And mistakes are part of the learning process, and it's really about that recovery with quick apology and correction. So we got a few more poll questions here. Just wondering how many, like what level you feel like you're leaving with the new policies for trans and non-binary athletes in hockey. And then we have one other question about your aha moments. But I'm going to pause here to see if Zach can see if there's been any Q&A or questions submitted through Q&A.
Yes, it looks like there is a question about building codes. I'm not sure if you're the best to address that, Kai. But I can read through it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've worked with architectural firms, so I know a thing or two. I'm not a specialist, but I'll speak to it generally.
Perfect. So the question is, building codes do not fully recognize gender inclusion, resulting in facilities being designed to accommodate only male/female genders. Is there a movement to change the building codes to reflect gender inclusion? There's a couple more parts of this question. What is required? Are universal washroom/change room connected to teams rooms? However, this is a fundamental change to the current accommodations for team sports and very costly. What measures are being proposed to move into this direction and or other physical solutions?
Great question. And of course, there's so much to it in terms of how a space is designed, how we navigate those spaces together and individually. So to the question around building codes, they are changing. There's a national level, provincial level, and sometimes local level building codes, and they are shifting. You're right that a lot of them only reference men and women, but they're recognizing that puts too much limitation on built space, and they are shifting to be more expansive to allow for more options for folks. It doesn't mean that men's and women's will go away, but it'll be, all gender options will be added into the mix. In terms of gender inclusion or what's required for, like, will team spaces have universal spaces attached to them? Not necessarily. So of course, if it exists, that's a great option within facilities that are leased or rented. Of course, that's not always the case. A lot of, especially older buildings, only have the option of men's and women's spaces. And that's why the team designation is so important. So it has the sign of a man or a woman to designate that facility, but for the purposes of your team using that space, it will be a team space, which may have multiple genders in them, and hence why there's the minimum attire piece to that equation. So it's not that it necessarily will be costly and that you're not having to renovate anything. Of course, you could advocate for that and talk to the facilities managers to say, hey, this is really important. We need more options. So that can oftentimes motivate them to make those changes. Also, if people are asking for specific accommodation, then it's exploring not just change rooms, but also multi-purpose rooms. There could be staff rooms that could be taken. There's a lot more in the implementation guide that can kind of spell out those options that can be that you can ask for with the facilities folks on site. Any other questions?
Nope, that's the only question right now.
That was okay. Fantastic. I've just switched to the next poll question, the final one, just any aha moments that you might have had during this session. And now I will go to 3 questions that have been submitted anonymously to continue the dialogue, but just only for a few minutes because I also want to hand things off to Phil to further talk about dressing room. What is the policy for players that currently do not wear a base layer under their equipment, no shirt as an example? I will actually pause on that one because I think Phil will fill out the picture further on that. And so we'll hold off on that question for now, but it's a good one. How should I best determine the pronouns of an entire team without singling out someone who might use less common pronouns than the other team members of that team. So yeah, thank you for raising it, wanting to do the right thing and provide space for people to provide their pronouns. There's many different ways of doing that, especially preseason chat. There's opportunities to share more generally about pronouns, what they are, how people can share them. It's important not to assume somebody's pronouns based on how they look. Just a few key points like that. And then you can open it to say, if you would like to share your pronoun, please come talk to me. And that way, if you're, I don't know what role you play, but then in that way, people can come forward and share that with you, and then you can talk about how perhaps to share with others, and in ways that are supportive of that person. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is just to use they/them pronouns for everyone until they share more about themselves. Either they do that in an indirect way, talking about themselves in the third person. Sometimes I say that, like, what kind of guy do I think I am? Or I'll say he about myself, in which case you can kind of glean that information from folks. So there's many different ways to get that information without singling out anybody and or jumping to conclusions about what somebody's pronouns are. Great question. Okay, what is the policy for players that currently do not wear base layer under their equipment? Oh, I believe we are what needs to be covered by. Okay, also a great question, and I'll leave base layer questions to Phil in the next section, which I think is a perfect segue to pass things off to Phil or Zach to provide the additional context for dressing room policy.
Absolutely, Kai. Thanks again for another great session. Tons of information. Each time I get to hear different parts of it, and and tonight I again gleaned some new information that is relevant as we continue this transition to the Hockey Canada dressing room policy and matching that up with our Ontario Human Rights settlement here in Ontario. So again, thank you very much for your time and your participation and the information provided. Zach, if you can fire up the other slide presentation, that'd be greatly appreciated. And I'll just touch on where we sit within the Ontario Hockey Federation. So I think the key point is just to take a look at history. Yeah, next slide is perfect, Zach. OHF back in 2009, we entered into the first of two human rights settlements. This was a mediated settlement that dealt with a dual gender dress room situation that was for boys and girls. And the contents of that dress room policy was about the team room being the team room. And it started out with a base layer concept that any team that had individuals that were boys and girls on a team, their task was to find the best way, given the facility they operated in, to get to a base layer level, and then to transition that into everyone into the same dressing room for the most amount of time, if possible, with a minimum of 15 minutes of time in the dressing room together. And that coaches' talks and speaking to players didn't occur until those individuals were in the dressing room. Following that, we had the Ontario added gender identity and expression to the Human Rights Code in 2012. The OHF policy on dressing room supervision is implemented in 2013. The policy that stands today. So as coaches, we talk about the Rule 2 that Kai talked about for the Hockey Canada policy. We have our dressing room supervision. There's some slight differences in that. We're matching those two items up so that they are consistent. The real core responsibility there is there's two adults in the room, monitoring the room and making sure that there isn't any abuse, bullying, harassment occurring in the room. And further with that supervision is that at least in our case, one is screened, and we will be progressing over time here to both individuals in the dressing room being screened individuals. Ideally, it's two screened coaches, but if there's an emergency in our situation, we do allow for one screened coach and another parent adult that's related to the team. So not someone who's totally independent, has to be someone who's connected with the team, a parent of a child, or another trainer or manager with the team in that situation. Then in 2016, and it was strictly on implementation of the co-ed dressing room policy and challenges with it, and with the change in the code and a lack of knowledge on behalf of our associations, we did enter into an agreement on a multi-gender dressing room policy. And that's a policy that continues to be in place today. Core principles didn't change from 2009. Base layer was the focus of that. And you're going to see here a theme here. We talk about base layer in 2009, base layer in 2016, 2023. We're talking about base layer again. It's about making the dressing room an inclusive area for all individuals, regardless of their, in this case, gender. Was the formation of it, but it also included, religion. It included, physical concerns, or just uncomfortability in the dressing room or whatsoever. And so we have within that policy the requirement of accommodation. And that's not to mean that we don't work towards an inclusive dressing room, as a whole. What we're doing is there's a requirement. If someone comes to you and says, hey, you know what? I need an accommodation here because I'm either of a different gender, or I don't feel comfortable in the dressing room in any situation. As coaches, we have to take that in a confidential way, and then we have to move forward with providing an accommodation without, addressing that need to the public of the team. So we would adjust our team policies, our team rules, and get that in place for us to make sure that it was an inclusive environment for every one of the players on our team. In 2017, Canada passed the C16 bill, which is basically the gender identity expression that was passed in Ontario in 2012 by, all standards and requirements. Hockey Canada now has adopted the gender policy and dressing room policy in June 2023, modified in September 2023, and education is launched. This is the education you're getting right now. And if you had the opportunity to listen to the entire session, there's lots of great information here, lots of learnings that we can take. And, it's about creating that safe space in the dressing room. And the reason why we're in a little bit of a difference is because there are some stricter things in our policy. So we are working to transition with components that are more strict in the Hockey Canada policy. And but we had to maintain certain areas of the human rights settlement so that we didn't contravene what we had in place. I'll touch base on those. That's the next slide, Zach. As far as the differences, I believe, in the two policies. So the Hockey Canada policy has a minimum attire defined and requirement for every minor hockey association team. Ours right now is implemented on an accommodation request, confidentiality by each team, saying that we also have a requirement for our coaches to be looking forward towards, creating an inclusive environment, and that may mean base layer. To the most extent, probably their U13 and below programs already have players coming in a lot of cases in a base layer structure, where they're not getting naked into the room and then transitioning out into a different base layer that they would have on. It will be a transition. We will be moving to a base layer for every team. We will be providing some advance notice of when that will be coming in, and working with the associations on that implementation. But it's already in a requirement. If you have anyone that that you requires an accommodation for any such reason, your job is to get your team to a base layer, and that might be before they get to the rink. That might be in, providing optional dressing rooms to get into the base layer, and then bringing together the team to be collective in one dressing room as a group. As Kaya identified kind of from the Hockey Canada structure, it may be going to a bathroom and changing into that base layer in the bathroom. That's where the comfortability is, and then coming into the collective dressing room. The accommodation request is only encouraged under Hockey Canada right now. It's a must for us. So if someone comes to you, you don't have the option to say, no, I'm not making an accommodation. I'm not providing it. You as associations and as coaches had the responsibility to, in a confidential way, provide that request and figure a solution out. And also be active and proactive with other teams that are coming to your facility. If you know you have a difficult facility to utilize for the purpose of getting changed to base layer, you should be checking with the team what they need for dressing room accommodations as they come into your facility to make sure that they know what the expectations are and what rooms they may have available as they enter into your facility. The rule 2 is stricter on Hockey Canada screening for everyone. Ours is, one screen coach, one non-screened individual. It will be changing to fully screened. We will be providing opportunities for our associations and a leeway to get everyone screened in that process as we transition over. The other thing about the rule 2 is there's intricacies around it, but other sports don't have trained and screened coaches. If you're a trained coach in our sport and you're participating as a team official in the OHF, you are screened. So their terminology and their structure is a little bit different in how they set out the requirements. The showering with a bathing suit on is a recommendation under the Hockey Canada policy. As we get to a situation of showering under an accommodation, it's your requirement to find a solution for showering under accommodation. And if that accommodation is, as you work out with an athlete, that, everyone should be showering in the same room, there's a comfortability with that, then it may be a bathing suit requirement. It may be a covered up, or, there's other options that are provided in the dressing room implementation policy that talks about showering in shifts, different things based on those specific accommodation requests. So those are the key differences. I think that the next step is an understanding of why and why we're dealing with base layer and moving forward. And I think Kai's probably touched on a lot of this throughout his presentation, but I'll touch on it a little bit from our end. So before I get to that, the core requirements. Every team official has to take the gender identity expression education, and so part of that is we're giving more education here than what was is already provided to all of our teams. Our coaches are trained on the current dressing room policy in place. We are working with the Ontario Human Rights Commission to change that training over to the national training and information with regards to that gender identity expression education. That will be a process, and hopefully for next year will be in place. And then there won't be a contradiction between the education our coaches have received and what their implementation structure is. Saying that, like we've stated it out that the base layer is an approach to get to as being proactive and providing safe spaces. I think it's an option that our teams may take on right now. They don't have to wait a longer term for that to be an accommodation. If there's a feeling that there's a positive way to implement that, then that implementation can occur. But our policy is based on an accommodation process. The confidentiality is important. And so one of the fundamental differences that we have within our policy that did come up in our process is that we have confidentiality for the individual that may be coming forward. And that individual's confidentiality doesn't need to necessarily include their parents being involved in the conversation. I won't go into the other items on here, but I would jump to the next slide there, Zach. So the why of the minimum tire, the dressing room is a place where, team activities and a safe place for all participants. It's the whole key with the minimum tire is we're not flaunting around the dressing room nude. As an individual, you may be comfortable being nude in front of other people. That's okay, but other individuals may not feel comfortable being, in a room where other people are nude. So for you as administrators, as coaches, it's about a situation of providing a comfortable space for all individuals. And participants won't need to feel isolated or fear their personal feelings in the dressing room. That aspect that they are the only one hiding and not being potentially open in the dressing room because they're wearing a base layer and no one else is. That's something that we don't necessarily know by looking at the appearance of an individual if they are of a particular gender or not. And we have to be cognizant of that we'll have individuals in our game that aren't based on the gender that they may display outwardly, and therefore if they're drawn out or forced out, it may be an uncomfortable environment for them to participate in the game in. it also provides a confidence level for the adults in the dressing room, that they don't have to worry about individuals, walking around naked in the dressing room. It's a comfort level that they're not exposed to that and, averting their eyes, and they can actually monitor the dressing room in a safe and in an appropriate way. And, ultimately we can find ways for the minimum tire not to be intrusive in the experience. And, we're working with Hockey Canada on that implementation. So we recognize there's limitations in facilities, and that's a challenge that we face in some of our Ontario facilities. But further to that, we'll find solutions that are easily, adaptable within the structure of a team setting. The bathing suit recommendation, people will say, why are we doing this? Obviously there's people who have showered nude for a number of years, and we talk about our U18 kids and that may have, be in that situation. But this has been a common sense approach that kids that, especially in the years of puberty, have gone through, where they don't feel comfortable necessarily being open in front of the rest of their teammates or athletes in that situation. So it's not something that's new. It's something that a lot of athletes have put in place themselves because it's a comfortable approach moving forward. And then what are the next steps? Right now, the OHF, HNO, and HEO are working with Hockey Canada to clarify these areas of contradiction to try to get a policy in place, because we don't want to contravene the Human Rights Commission requirements. But we can expect, as a collective group of organizations, we will be going to a base layer requirement. The question is not if, the question is when, but we will be providing an opportunity of a transition in, so that everyone will have the ability to deal with that implementation and processing to that approach as we mesh the two different policies together. And that will be over the course of the coming months or coming weeks here as we work with Hockey Canada. Zach, I think it's open for questions. I'm going to pair off this one on device and go into my other device, but happy to answer any questions for the group here.
Doesn't look like there are too many questions. I'll wait till Phil jumps back on, maybe, if he is on still. No, he's still on.
I am on there. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry. It looks like the only question we have is, what is the minimum base layer expected for either gender? So maybe just some more clarification, Phil, on what exactly is the minimum base layer.
The minimum base layer will be something that covers the torso and covers the pelvic area. So that will be looking at a pair of compression shorts, a pair of longer boxer briefs, and a t-shirt or a compression shirt that would be in place. And so that would be what is listed as the base layer within our policy as a requirement. And that may be in different areas that we get into that, or that will be in a situation where they come with that on in that situation.
Thank you, Phil. Another question, does a bathing suit also mean a swim shirt?
So not in this case. And I think this is part of the transition that we're working through with Hockey Canada on the transition of the recommendation of the bathing suit. So there's not a strict direction on this right now. So when you do go into the shower, it'd be what you would wear at a public pool or at a beach with regards to the showering requirements. But there are some intricacies there that we will be working out and clarifying.
There's another question on if we'll get copies of all the documents or all the copies of the pages from both Kai and Phil's presentation. I believe, yes, we can provide copies of the presentation, or at least the recording of this session will be sent out after recording is complete. But Phil, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, or Kai. I'm sure we'd be happy to send this out to everyone after.
Yeah, and no problem from our end. I know we have one more presentation coming up. When is that, Zach? On the November 1st? Is that it?
November 1st, yeah.
And so, I would like to hold off until after November 1st on the slide presentation from our end and be in a situation where we are able to present to that group. And, as we are actively in the process, I want to ensure that, there's not a change to that slide presentation by the time we get to November 1st. So following November 1st, we'll definitely be sharing out the most up-to-date information as of November 1st.
There are also a few handouts as well with summary of the terms and concepts and a few tips and tools for anyone interested as well.
And Zach, we can provide links directly to our dressing room policy and confidentiality statement and the implementation guides of both those within the information going out.
Perfect. Sounds good. Another quick question I see, what time does this go until? This was scheduled until 8, but once the Q&A session ends, then we'll end the session. But another question, what if players do not wear a base layer?
Well, I mean, right now, this is about education. And, both Kai and I, having had the opportunity to do education and continue to do education throughout this, is, we're not going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. And, it's about educating on the reasons why. And so that's what we'll be coming back with. If someone, decides not to wear the base layer, we're not talking about punitive damage right now. We're talking about the aspect of how do we educate and understand and get to a place that we're showing that inclusive and safe environment for all individuals.
All right, another question, is this also going to be shared with girls hockey?
All the information has been shared with girls hockey. They're more than welcome to come on these calls, saying that the OWHA has implemented the Hockey Canada policy to a certain degree. I'm not sure if they made any changes to it. They did put out their OWHA policy. So my understanding is they are doing education with the girls' associations.
All right, another question. To confirm, a VSC bench staff and an adult attached to the team works for the rule of 2?
At this point, that is dressing room supervision policy, and the OHF will provide that out as well, Zach, on this. Ideally, our approach would be 2 VSC-approved bench staff or team officials that are your rule of 2. If that's not possible for whatever reason, someone's not there on time or caught in traffic, then yes, we allow for the opportunity for one trained individual and another coach or parent in that situation. We will be looking towards a transitioning standpoint here, and we're working out some details on that where there will be a screening process or screening adaptation that will come into effect for those other adults that will be supporting the team on the rule of 2.
All right, it looks like one more question. How will education be provided to parents?
Well, education, they're welcome to reach out, and we've reached out and worked with the parents that have contacted the OHF. This recording can be something that I'm sure you can share with parents so that if they have any questions, they can listen to the conversation from this recording. And then, secondary to that, it's individual to your association. And if you want support and need support in that, there's opportunities where we will, get the right people together to support a group of associations if that's something that is not necessary or needed on the education.
All right, it looks like that is all the questions we have. Kai, I'm not sure if we missed any questions from your end that Phil may have not answered.
No, that summarized it very well, and I don't see any others on Menti, so we're all clear.
Well, again, from the Ontario Hockey Federation standpoint, Kai, really appreciate your time and tonight to provide the education to another, fairly large group of people here. I think we were about the same as last time, like near a couple hundred people. So really appreciate the association's time in stepping on the phone and being part of the conversation and the excellent questions. And we're here to support you, to help you. If there's other questions that come up after this, don't hesitate to get them to Zach. Zach will be happy to work on those and bring that information forward to either Kai or myself collectively to get solutions back to you as associations as we transition into the new policies. Have a great night.
Goodbye.